Well, hi everyone, and welcome to That OA Thing. I'm Donald Galligan, the Chief Executive of the Ombudsman Association, and today I'm joined by Catherine Evans O'Brien, the Head of Communities at the UK Information Commissioner's Office, to talk about outreach and community engagement projects. So thank you for joining us, Catherine.
Hi, Donald. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you on. As many of you who are regular listeners might already be aware, as well as setting best practice criteria for ombudsman schemes, we also have another category of membership for organisations like the ICO that are not ombudsman but are involved in complaint handling. So to start us off, Catherine, could you just give us a brief overview of the ICO's role?
Yeah, of course. So at the ICO, our sort of mission, I suppose, what we say is that we work to empower people through information, and we uphold information rights for the public. But what does that actually mean? So we're the regulator for data protection and freedom of information rights, and we do regulate a few other pieces of legislation as well. So in practice, we have a few enforcement powers if organisations are falling foul of their obligations, such as issuing reprimands and a fine. But we've also got a massive amount of information, support and guidance on our website. And as you mentioned, we've got a helpline for the public and a complaints function that people can come to us and use if they're concerned about how an organisation has used their information.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. That was great. I have to say as well that head of communities is a great job title.
Yeah.
So could you explain a little more about what your role involves and what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, sure. It is a great job title. I feel very lucky to have this role, and it's still relatively new. So I've been in post for about a year, and I'm the first post holder. We haven't had this role before at the ICO, and something that I constantly grapple with, I suppose, is that recognition that the concept of communities is vast and can mean different things to different people. But I think that's it, really. People can feel part of different communities at different times in their lives, in different circumstances, and that can change and that can be fluid. But what's important to us at the ICO and why my role exists is so everybody can have access to and benefit from their information rights. But through the work that we've done and the experience that we've gathered over sort of a number of years, we're aware that this can be really difficult and a lot more challenging for some people compared to others. So some people might experience harm differently or more acutely, for example, in relation to a data breach, or their personal circumstances might make them more susceptible to feeling that harm. So what I do sort of in my role as head of communities is try and identify if there are particular groups of people or people with certain characteristics or the way that they identify where there could be barriers or more challenges to them accessing and making the most of their information rights. So for me, really, day to day, what that means is working across a massive variety of teams across the whole organisation to really think about how we can reach specific communities, which will change depending upon the piece of work or the project that we're working on, and try and find out how we can sort of better work with or target different groups of people depending on what that piece of work is and what information advice they could most benefit from. So it's vast.
It's
It can
big,
change all the
yeah.
time.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, as you say, it's across the whole organisation and kind of shift. And I find it really interesting that not only, as you say, that the projects you're working on and where you're focused will shift depending on the issue, but also that really helpful reminder, I think, that communities are fluid as well. That
Yeah,
we can't just put a label on a group of people and put them in a box and say, well, that's where they are. The same individual might be in a different community another time, or people might
absolutely.
move in or out. It's
Yeah.
really interesting. We spoke a little bit before about those kind of community engagement projects. We're going to talk a little bit more about that now. You hinted at that, and I guess that point about the real life impacts that data breaches can have on people, it can sometimes seem a little bit theoretical
Yeah.
and the rest of it. Could you go a little bit into? I know there'll be some things you can't talk about in detail, but could you able to discuss a little bit more some of those examples and the real life impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point, especially when we think about what we do at the ICO in data protection. It's full of technical terms. Sometimes it's full of legislation, legalistic language. And part of what I sort of work really hard to do is to remember, remind us all in the work that we do, bring it closer to the people who are at the heart of sort of the legislation, the regulations and the rules that were developed. So I suppose example of this is at the end of last year, sort of the beginning of this year, we became specifically aware at the ICO that there are some communities who can be particularly at risk of harm from a data breach. So two great examples of that we noticed a trend in reprimands that we had issued, where the victim of a data breach was a domestic abuse survivor, and they were particularly at risk of huge life impacts, such as having to move into temporary accommodation because their address had become known, and once more becoming fearful for their lives. Alongside that, around about the same time frame, we were contacted by the National AIDS Trust organisation, who raised concerns with us about the sort of huge impact of stigma and discrimination that can be experienced by people living with HIV when their status is shared when it shouldn't have been. So we set up a project, and that's what I led on over the last the first half of 2024, to try and better explore how the experiences of these communities who'd experienced a data breach, what their experiences were, and whether there was anything extra, anything additional that we could be doing at the ICO to improve the information and support that we can give. Now, obviously, gold star would be that the breach didn't happen in the first place. Yeah. But they sadly, sometimes these things do happen. So we had to start thinking about, well, if it does happen, what can we do to improve their experiences? Now, I'm more than happy to go into a little bit more detail about the work that we did.
No. I'm really just before you could tell there was a question on my face, wasn't there? You could see. I was just interested when you were talking about the trend, particularly with domestic abuse. And sorry, maybe you were planning to cover this anyway, but I just wondered: is it where these breaches are coming, and you're having to go in and explain to people? Are you having to go in and educate people about domestic abuse and about the impacts of that and why that's important? Or is it a case of, no, we understand all of that, it's just that we made a mistake, we were doing we know that we shouldn't have shared that, and we is there a trend? Is it sometimes both?
So that's a really good question, and I think what makes our job at the ICO quite challenging sometimes is that data protection kind of cuts across every part of life, and sometimes some of the most sensitive parts of life as well. So our staff at the ICO find themselves in situations where they're not just talking about data protection, they might be touching upon lots of other really sensitive, important subjects as well. So, I mean, what I would say, it's not necessarily our role at the ICO to educate about domestic sort of abuse, as one example, whereas what our staff do have and will do, particularly when they're talking to people who get in touch with us from members of the public, is we have sort of resources and signposting that we're able to do to show people, if you haven't been in contact with this organisation, then go there, speak to them, just so we're not putting ourselves at risk of sharing information where we're not perhaps the best placed to do that. But from the position of the organisations, what we did find when we spoke to people through this piece of work, through this project, people were telling us that they didn't feel like the impact on them. So, for example, because they were a survivor, the fact that their address was shared has a much more higher level of risk compared to somebody who wasn't. And they felt like that wasn't really recognised by the organisations at the time. And they felt like the focus perhaps in an organisational response was much more towards the procedural, administrative stuff that needs to get done, as opposed to taking the time to learn and figure out from the individual why what's happened has so much impact, and maybe asking, what can we do to help? Talk to us, explain to us, why has this been so impactful on you? What are the things that we can do as an organisation to support you and lessen that impact? And now, the organisation who has conducted the breach may not be the best place to fix all of those, but if the point of asking and finding out and then being in a position to signpost was really valuable, was really needed and wanted by people, and they didn't always feel like that was something that they had received.
I think that's something that our listeners to the podcast and our members would recognize, that point about humanizing the bureaucracy
Yeah.
almost, recognizing the individual and the impact has on them, I think is a big point of the work that obviously yourselves and ombudsman and other complaint handling bodies, it's always at the heart of they want to do, and trying to educate others
Yeah.
about that as well. It's fascinating. We touched a little bit there on the domestic abuse one. You mentioned about the project of people living with HIV as well. Were there slightly different issues at play there, or was it similar?
So they are different issues. There's different sensitivities and there's different challenges, and the risks and experiences are different as well. So, for example, when we were talking to people living with HIV, and they were talking to us about their experiences or concerns about their information sort of being shared, it was quite closely linked to the stigma and discrimination that might come as part of that. So, for people talk to us about feeling pressurized to leave their place of employment because of the sort of experiences they had in discrimination in the workplace and conversations, unwelcome conversations with colleagues, and that had made them feel like they needed to not be in that place of work anymore, which is awful. And so the direct experiences, the lived experiences of the people were different within these two groups, and we don't try and sort of understand them as the same. But I think why we wanted to do sort of this piece of work under one sort of project umbrella was because there were two groups, two communities of people who were particularly at high risk of harm if they'd experienced a breach. That's the common element, I suppose, between the two of them, but totally recognizing that they're not the same experiences.
What did the projects consist of? Again, understanding that they're different communities
Yeah.
and would have involved different things. But could you give listeners an idea of what the project actually involved and the work that you did?
Yeah, sure. So we were really lucky to be able to work. I've already mentioned one organisation, the National AIDS Trust, who proactively had got in touch with us actually because they were concerned. But then we were able to work quite closely with three other charities. So that was Terence Higgins Trust, also from the HIV/AIDS point of view, and then Women's Aid and Women's Aid Scotland. And we did quite a lot of work with them. So in terms of our direct engagement, we had focus groups with people who'd had these lived experiences, one-to-one conversations, because recognizing that individuals might not want to speak in a focus group environment on some of these topics. And then we undertook a trauma-informed customer journey mapping exercise as well to look at our own, as in the ICO processes, if someone were to get in touch with us, what their experience would be. And what was really valuable, I think, working with these four charities in the run-up to undertaking that sort of engagement work was being able to really understand what the best methods of engagement would be, most appropriate methods for engagement with the communities that we wanted to speak to, having their input in how we could structure meetings, how we could engage with a conversation, and then also really importantly, working with them to identify people that would be happy to speak to us about this topic. So, building up those connections, those relationships with those organisations, move into a stage where we could undertake those focus groups, those conversations, that customer journey mapping. And we had so much depth of findings and information from that we were then able to take away and really do some specific actions as a result. And then obviously looping back in with the people that we'd spoken to let them know what had happened as well. So yeah, that was the general gist of what we did.
It sounds like a fascinating piece of work. You were saying that you're the first person with your job title at the ICO. Is this piece of work a bit of a change as well? Was this kind of work going on before but being led by someone else, or is this a new approach?
So we have at the ICO we have engaged. We have done public engagement and engagement with different groups related to specific pieces of work. So, in the past we've undertaken public opinion surveys, we've undertaken citizen jury exercises on specific pieces of work. But I think it's fair to say this is the we're treading new ground in terms of how closely and directly we're engaging with people who have had experiences related to sort of their information rights outside of the complaints process. So obviously we engage very regularly with people who want to talk to us about these issues within the confines of their specific complaint. But we took it outside of the complaints process, and used a really, we're really conscious to use, I just mentioned it previously, a trauma-informed approach in the way that we were speaking to people and engaging with people on this, and then using those findings to so directly try and impact what we do then next, as a regulator. That's relatively new for the ICO, and it's, to my knowledge, the first project that's taken it sort of this directly back out to communities.
It's great to hear. And that point about trauma-informed approach, I know that some of our colleagues, those in Scotland in particular, this won't be new to them. It's something they've taken on board. But we had our conference in June. We had a particular session on that, and it went down really well.
Yeah.
And I think what was one of the really interesting bits of feedback from our members really was a lot of the stuff they are doing, or they've been trying to do, they know it's the right thing, but they didn't necessarily have the framework to do it within. And I think that's the interesting point. And your experience at the ICO, I think, is going to be really, really helpful to share on that. Now, of course, you have recently been elected deputy chair for the new Outreach Network. Yeah. Congratulations again. So as I've got you here, can I ask what you see the benefits are of that network and being part of the wider OA community?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be taking on this role as deputy chair of the Outreach Network. I think for me, there's there's lots of benefits, but two main benefits, I suppose. The first, of the network in particular, is making new connections with people who are doing maybe not exactly the same, but similar things across different member organisations. I know what I was talking about is relatively new ground for us at the ICO, but others might have tread that ground before. So, from my perspective, it can be quite challenging sometimes setting up a new approach. So it's always helpful to have friendly contacts who are doing similar. And then I think linked to this is having an opportunity to listen and learn from what others have done as well, and thinking about how you can apply that to the work that I do. And then I think in relation to the wider sort of community, the Ombudsman Association community, I know very, very recently the Ombudsman Association were able to link us up at the ICO with another member to take forward a really specific discussion about sort of development within our complaints and casework service. And that was a connection, that's going to be an incredibly helpful conversation for us to help develop our own service based on work that other people have already done. And I don't think we would have been able to make that link and had that conversation had we not been member of the community. So I suppose I've said three things, but I think they're probably all pretty linked, aren't they? In terms
well,
of
all good. So
we'll
allow it. We'll allow it, Catherine. They can stay. And I think that point you were making before about the communities and communities being fluid and the rest of it, and that point about learning, is that there's a risk sometimes that people could be seen as this is an individual who has a complaint about how their data was handled, and this is an individual who had a complaint about their treatment at the NHS, and this is an individual who had a complaint about an energy company. Well, it's all the same person. So that learning, it's not just about taking good practice from elsewhere, but a lot of the time the cohort of people that our members are dealing with, there's overlap in that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able to see the full person behind the complaint is difficult but necessary, and it's a huge skill. So hats off to people working in those frontline roles as well, who are juggling that, because it's hard.
Absolutely. I feel like we could probably talk for forever on this, but I guess one last question is to say to you, what would you say, or ask you, what would you say is the best thing about working as head of communities at the ICO?
That's a difficult question. similar. I want to say two things, but I think they're sort of linked. In terms of how rewarding it has been over the last year to make connections with new communities, or if you're comms minded, new audiences, however you want to think about it, just making it can be really difficult trying to narrow down and identify who we should speak to and how about particular issues, but working through that and being able to really hone down on a specific issue that really really affects people, and then being able to see something out of it, I think that's the best thing, and I'm looking forward to doing it more as well as time goes on.
Well, that's pretty good, and I think that's a really good note to leave it on. So, thank you so much, Catherine, for joining us today and sharing your reflections.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
It's been good to have you on. And to you, dear listeners, thank you for joining us. Do please share with your colleagues and stay connected with us on social media. You can find us on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Threads under the name Ombudsman Association. And hopefully you'll join us again next time.